Good morning, children. Today we are going to discuss about another important concept is in the circulatory system. What is the next concept is the cardiac cycle. What is the cardiac cycle and what are the steps or phases in the cardiac cycle? We will be discuss. Okay. In the previous classes we discussed about the heart internal structure and what are the walls located present in the heart, locations of the different walls. Okay, so like that we discussed in the previous classes, but in this class we are going to discuss about the cardiac cycle. What is cardiac cycle, how it will be there, how it will be work, how many phases are there in the cardiac cycle, that one we will be discuss. Observe very carefully, children. The events first point I am telling, the events that occur at the beginning of heartbeat, the events that occur at the beginning of heartbeat and last until the beginning of next beat is called cardiac cycle. So this is a very important. What I am telling, the events that occur at the beginning of the heartbeat and the last until the beginning of the next beat is called cardiac cycle. So first point is very clear. So the events that occur, okay, beginning of the heartbeat and last until the beginning of the next beat is called cardiac cycle. First point clear. The second point, it lasts for the duration. How many seconds? The cardiac cycle duration is 0.8 seconds. Very important need bit. The duration of the cardiac cycle is 0.8 seconds. The series of events that takes place in the cardiac cycle, number one. What are those? Number one, totally 5 phases are there. Phase 1, okay, phase 1, next phase 2, next phase 3, okay, like this, phase 3, next phase 4, next phase 5. Like this, the 5 phases are there in the events of the cardiac cycle. Okay, first one we are discussing about phase 1. First phase is ventricular diastole. What's the meaning of ventricular diastole? Relaxation. So the pressure in the auricles increases than that of the ventricular pressure. So then what will happen? The pressure in the auricles increases than that of the ventricular pressure. Then AV valves are open while the semilunar valves are closed. Blood flows from the auricles into the ventricles passively. So you know very well. The pressure is there in the auricle increases than that of the ventricular pressure. Then what will happen? Auricles to auriculoventricular valves are there or not? Tricuspid valve and bicuspid valves are open. While the semilunar valves, you know, the aortic valve and pulmonary valve will be closed. For example, this is a heart, right? In this heart, what is this? Right auricle, left auricle, right ventricle, left ventricle. So here the valves are open. So auricles to blood will go to ventricles. That time this aortic pulmonary valve and aortic valve will be closed. So that is the first step. Once again, so ventricular diastole. What is the meaning of that? The auricular pressure in the auricles increases. Then that of the ventricular pressure. Then AV valves are open while the semilunar valves are closed. The blood flows from the auricles into the ventricles passively. Auricles to ventricles passively. This is the first point you should have to remember. Then second phase, what will happen? What will happen in the second phase? Come and listen. Atrial systole. Here ventricular diastole completed. Diastole means relaxation. Ventricles relaxation. Here what? Atrial systole. Systole means what? Contraction. Now you say the atria contracts while the ventricles are still relaxed. The atria will be contract. The atria contracts while the ventricles are still relaxed. The contraction of the auricles pushes the maximum volume of blood to the ventricles until they reach the end diastolic volume. End diastolic volume. See, once again I am telling to you, atrial systole, the atria contracts while the ventricles are still relaxed. So contraction of auricles pushes maximum volume of blood to the ventricles until they reach the end diastolic volume. Next one, the end diastolic volume is related to the length of the cardiac muscle fiber. More the muscle is stretched, more the muscles are stretched, grades the EDV and the stroke volume. So depend upon the what you called the fibers. This is important, cardiac muscle fiber. The EDV is their maximum volume of blood to the ventricles until they reach the end diastolic volume. EDV is related to the length of the cardiac muscle fiber. More the muscles is stretched, greater the EDV and the stroke volume. EDV is related to the length of the cardiac muscle fiber. More the muscle is stretched, greater the what you called end diastolic volume and the stroke volume. Next, phase 3, what will happen? Phase 3 is ventricular systole. Here, what is the isovolumetric contraction? Isovolumetric contraction means similar contraction in the ventricles. The ventricular contraction forces the AV valves to close. So, tricuspid and bicuspid valves will be closed and increases the pressure inside the ventricles. The blood is then pumped from the ventricles into the aorta without changing the size of the muscle fiber length and ventricular chamber volume. So, without, what happened? Listen carefully. Without change in the size of muscle fiber length and ventricular chamber volume. So, isovolumetric contraction. Once again, listen carefully. Isovolumetric contraction. The ventricular contraction forces the AV valves. What are the AV valves? Tricuspid valve and bicuspid valve to close and increases the pressure inside the ventricles. Increases the pressure inside the ventricles. Blood is pumped from the ventricles to the aorta, you know where, without changing the size of the muscle fiber, length the ventricular chamber volume. So that is only called isovolumetric contraction. Another one is what? Ventricular systole, that is also contraction only, but here what? Ventricular ejection. So increased ventricular pressure forces the semilunar valves to open and blood is ejected out of the ventricles without backflow of the blood. This point is the end of systolic volume. So without the backflow of the blood will be sent out to the right side pulmonary aorta, you know very well, left side systemic aorta, blood will be go. So what is that one? Increased ventricular pressure forces the semilunar valves to open. What are the semilunar valves here? What are the semilunar valves? The aortic valve and pulmonary valve to open and blood is ejected out of the ventricles without the backflow of blood. This point is end of the systolic volume. So here what happened? Here muscle fiber length and ventricular chamber volume without any change. But here what is here? Valves to open and blood is ejected out of the ventricles without backflow of the blood. So this point is end of the systolic volume. Next, ventricular diastole. Ventricular diastole. Here what will happen? The ventricles begin to relax. Now contraction is going on. Blood is went to systemic aorta and pulmonary artery. So then what will happen next? The ventricles begin to relax. Pressure in the arteries. Okay. Pressure forces increased. What do you call this one? The ventricles begin to relax. The pressure in the arteries exceeds ventricular pressure, resulting in the closure of, so arteries pressure will be increased, then automatically closure of which one? The semilunar valves will be takes place. The heart returns to the phase 1 of the cardiac cycle. What is the phase 1? Ventricular diastole. So like this, what are those? Ventricular diastole will be there. Next, arterial systole. Next, ventricular systole, isovolumetric contraction and ventricular ejection. Last one, ventricular diastole. Like this, the 5 phases. How many phases are there in the cardiac cycle? 5 phases. What is the first one? ventricular diastole. The pressure in the auricles increases than that of the ventricular pressure. Then AV valves are open while the semilunar valves are closed. Blood flows from the auricles into the ventricles passively. So passive means without any energy. So actively means with supporting of energy. But here blood is flowing without energy. So that is why passively we are calling. The second phase is atrial systole. The atria contracts while the ventricles are still relaxed. When the ventricles are relaxed, the atria will be contract. The contraction of the auricle pushes maximum volume of the blood to the ventricles until they reach the end diastolic volume. So, end diastolic volume is related to the length of the cardiac muscle fiber. So, more the muscle fiber stretched, greater the end diastolic, what is called diastolic volume and the stroke volume. What is this point? Length of the cardiac muscle fiber. More the muscle fiber stretched, greater the end diastolic volume and the stroke volume. Next phase 3, ventricular systole isovolumetric contraction. What will happen? The ventricular contraction forces the AV valves to close and increase the pressure inside the ventricles. The blood is then pumped from the ventricles into the aorta without changing the size of the muscle fiber length and ventricular chamber volume. So that's why it's called isovolumetric contraction. Next, ventricular systole, ventricular ejection. Increased ventricular pressure forces the semilunar valves to open. Here what is going on? These valves, AV valves are closing. Here semilunar valves are opening and blood is ejected out of the ventricles without backflow of blood. This point is the end of systolic volume. The phase 5, ventricular diastole. The ventricles begin to relax, pressure in the arteries exceeds ventricular pressure, resulting in the closure of semilunar valves. The heart returns to the phase 1 of the cardiac cycle. So like this, closing of semilunar valves, closing of auriculoventricular valves. So with this help of this only, laptop sound will be there and that kind of mechanism also we discussed. So ventricular diastole, atrial systole, stroke volume, ventricular systole, isovolumetric contraction, ventricular ejection, ventricular diastole. Like this, there are different phases are there in the cardiac cycle. Next, come to another important point we are going to discuss is the cardiac output. What is the meaning of cardiac output? So this is also one of the important NEET bit. In the previous NEET exams, they given some problems about this also related to the cardiac output. What is cardiac output and what's the importance of cardiac output will be discussed now. Observe very carefully the cardiac output. The cardiac output in the sense the amount of the blood pumped out by each ventricle per minute is called cardiac output. What I'm saying, the amount of blood pumped out by each ventricle per minute. Okay, for example, I'm telling right ventricle sends the blood to pulmonary artery. Left ventricle sends the oxygenated blood to systemic aorta. How much amount is pumping out from ventricle to the different two aortas is called per minute, is called cardiac output. Another way, the amount of blood pumped out by each ventricle per minute is called cardiac output. So this is a very important definition. The amount of the blood pumped out by each ventricle is called cardiac output. So the product of heart rate or pulse is the number of beats per minute. Next, another important one we are discussing. Another important point, the heart rate or the pulse is the number of, we are discussing about now another important definition. Heart rate or pulse. Heart rate or pulse. This is the one. This is the definition. For what? Heart rate. The heart rate or pulse is the, what I am telling, the heart rate or the pulse is the number of beats per minute. Okay, number of beats per minute. So heart rate or pulse is the number of beats per minute is called, what you call, that is the heart rates. Okay, next another important point here discuss is, what is that one? The pulse pressure is equal to, what is that one? Pulse pressure is equal to systolic pressure minus, what is that one? Systolic pressure minus diastolic pressure is equal to pulse pressure. What is the pulse, or what is called, what I said, the heart rate? Heart rate or pulse is both are equal to number of beats per minute. That is called heart rate or pulse. Then how can you define the pulse pressure? The pulse pressure is equal to, the pulse pressure is equal to systolic pressure minus diastolic pressure. So 120 by 80. So for example, what's the normal blood pressure? 120 by 80 mmHg, you know very well. So 120 minus 80. So you know 40. So pulse pressure is equal to 40. So like that, there will be pulse pressure also is there in our circulation system. Next, another important one, I'm telling here, the stroke volume. What is SV? The stroke volume. What is the definition of stroke volume? The volume of blood pumped out by one ventricle with each beat. What is the stroke volume? The volume of blood pumped out by one ventricle with each beat. So after one beat, how much amount of blood is coming out from the one ventricle? Either right ventricle or left ventricle, whatever it may be. That will be called, what do you call? Stroke volume. Once again, children, the cardiac output means the amount of blood pumped out by each ventricle per minute is called cardiac output. Next, the heart rate or pulse is called the number of beats per minute. Next, pulse pressure is equal to systolic pressure minus diastolic pressure. Next, stroke volume is equal to volume of blood pumped out by one ventricle with each beat. So don't confuse these all definitions. Maybe definitely will come in the exam. So cardiac output, the amount of blood pumped out by each ventricle per minute. What is a pulse or heart rate? The number of heartbeats per minute. What is the pulse pressure? Systolic pressure minus diastolic pressure. What's the stroke volume? The volume of blood pumped out by one ventricle with each beat is called the stroke volume. As tomorrow we will be discuss completely about what is ESV and what is EDV, systolic volume, diastolic volume. Okay, so these all we will be discuss in the ventricular volumes. Okay, pulmonary congestion, blood pressure. Okay, these all the concepts will be discussed in the next class. What's the importance of sphygmomanometer? Okay, electrocardiogram. These points will be discussed in the tomorrow's class. Okay, volume of blood remaining in the ventricle after contraction is called ESV. Okay, amount of blood that collects in a ventricular during diastole is called EDV. So what is EDV? What is ESV will be discussed in the next class, children. So up to that, what are the bits? Ventricular diastole means what? Arterial systole means what? Isovolumetry contraction means what? And ventricular ejection means what? And what is when the ventricular diastole? Okay, ventricular ejection, ventricular diastole means what? And what is cardiac output? What is pulse or heart rate? And what is pulse pressure? Systolic pressure minus diastolic pressure. And what is SV volume? Okay, volume of blood pumped out by stroke volume. So pumped out by one ventricle with each beat. Like that, the bits you should have to remember. Complete discussion about the different volumes. Okay, different volumes and blood pressure and blood electrocardiogram. So like that, ECG, such kind of concepts will be discussed. Why? Because all concepts are important, and what is double circulation, this kind of things will be there. Single circuit circulation will be discussed in the next class.